Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I really appreciate your time joining us at the end of what is no doubt a very busy day, a little bit over halfway through a very busy term. So I'm hopeful that this session will be really useful for you today as we consider the materials and teaching and learning support provided as part of the Mastery Mathematics Year 9 project. We're aiming to finish right on 4:30, so a tight 45-minute session. If you've got questions as we go along, if we've got some time at the end, we'll address some of those. If you can pop them into the chat as we go, my colleague Trish will just keep an eye on them and boost them up as we go, so that I can address any of the questions that you might have. I'm just going to share my screen. Well, welcome everybody. My name's Reid Smith. I'm co-CEO of Ochre Education. We're a not-for-profit organisation that's working as part of this project alongside the National Catholic Education Commission. I'm joining you from Ballarat in regional Victoria. I'm sitting about 50 metres away from Yarrawee Creek, where the traditional custodians of the lands on which I sit, the Wadawurrung people, have tended the waterways and the lands for tens of thousands of years. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands that we join on today. On behalf of Ochre Education and the National Catholic Education Commission, we'd like to pay our respects to elders past and present and extend those respects to any First Nations people that are joining us today. So today we're aiming to do three things. The first one is just to give a brief overview of this project, a Mastery in Mathematics, who's involved and how it came to be and what the aims are. We'll spend a little bit of time looking at the curriculum level materials that are currently available for the Year 9 project. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the lesson level materials that will be created over the next 3 terms to provide you and your schools with support. So this project is under the auspice of the National Catholic Education Commission. We at Ochre Education, we're a not-for-profit organisation that works to share the expertise and experience of teachers all over the country. And we're working with a number of partner schools on this particular project. So we're working with the Melbourne Archdiocese of Catholic Schools, Catholic Education Sandhurst, Catholic Education Canberra and Goulburn, and also Catholic Education South Australia. We're working with teachers that are at each of those partner organisations, as well as some other teachers from other schools in Australia, to share their expertise through curriculum and lesson level materials with you. The Mastery Mathematics project, our aim really is to support all teachers with your work. That's what we're aiming to do as part of this particular project. And we think it's an opportune time to do this with the introduction of a range of different curriculum, the Australian curriculum version 9, the Victorian curriculum version 2.0, and the new New South Wales syllabus. The way that we work is to work with teachers from the participating dioceses to collaborate, to create lessons and to support their colleagues. And this Mastering Mathematics Year 9 project builds on the work we've already done over the last 12 months, developing resources for Year 7 and Year 8, or Stage 4 in New South Wales. Ultimately, this project will develop around 108 lessons, give or take 5 lessons, and those lessons will be provided that aligned with the Australian curriculum version 9. We'll provide around 108 lessons for the Victorian curriculum version 2 and around 108 lessons for the new New South Wales syllabus. And if you're heading onto the Ochre website, you can actually find curriculum materials that are associated with the Mastery Mathematics Year 9 project right now. And I'll be going through what some of those curriculum materials look like. And the Term 1 materials are going to be available at the end of this month. So all of those lessons for Term 1, Year 9 will be available at the end of November for you and your team to download and adjust to your particular context. The other materials for Terms 2 through to 4 will be made progressively available over the course of the first half of next year, with the Term 2 materials available about halfway through Term 1, and then the other materials a term ahead of time for you and your teams to look at. One of the important things for us to note as we're developing these resources and making them available for you and your teams is that these resources are optional. They're there for you and your teams to use however you see fit. They are adaptable to your particular context and your groups of students. So everything that is made as part of this project is made in an editable form. We make them available in Google Slides and Google Docs, and also to be downloaded into Microsoft products, and they're all there to be adaptable for you. So you can make any changes that you need to based on the number of lessons that you have available, the way that your classes and your school is structured, the cohorts of students that you have coming through. These resources are designed to be grist for the learning mill at your school. We'll be describing through this webinar a few ways that you can adapt those materials for your particular context. And our first layer of support really comes in what we call the curriculum planning resources. And there's a number of different levels that exist. So first of all, we have yearly overviews. And the purpose of the yearly overviews is to provide our recommendation about how the concepts in Year 9 or Year A of Stage 4 or Stage 5 can be stepped out over the course of a year. And so it just gives a rough idea about how we've programmed or thought about programming things over the course of a year. The unit overviews provide a little bit more detail as to what's contained in each of the units that are developed as part of this program. We then take that information from the unit overviews and we step it out lesson by lesson in a scope and sequence. And the purpose of the scope and sequence is to provide an at-a-glance view of the learning intentions for each of the lessons in a particular unit and the curriculum codes and syllabus outcomes that they've designed to address. We then provide some unit plans that provide some teaching guidance, as well as mini lesson plans that give you a bit of an idea about what the intentions are for each of the lessons that are provided as part of this Mastery in Mathematics program. And then lastly, we have what we call precedence diagrams, which describe some of the ways in which units and lessons are related to each other, and some of the things you need to keep in mind if you're looking to omit units of work or to change the orders of particular units. But I'm going to take a little bit of time to go through each of these layers of curriculum in detail, just so you can get a sense about what's actually available for you and your team. So first off, we have the yearly overviews. They are there for you to use and adjust. So when you're thinking about the yearly overviews, you can adjust the units in our yearly overviews in terms of their order and length. You can decide to implement one or more units at a time that is suitable for your school. So you may look at the unit overview or the yearly overviews and decide that this is a unit that you'd like to use, but you prefer not to use these other ones. Or although we have a unit scheduled in a particular time in the yearly overview, you'd like to move them to somewhere else in the year, depending on your scheduling and the way that you put your mathematics together. And you can choose from units or lessons to supplement existing plans. So we know that some schools choose to use the entire OCA curriculum as their mathematics curriculum. Some schools will take particular units or parts of units, and then other schools will take just a unit or particular lessons that they use as grist for their planning and learning. So the yearly overviews look a little bit like this. So this is an example from the Australian curriculum. We've broken down each of the terms into 10 weeks. You can see that we've programmed 10 weeks in term 1, and then we've allocated 8 weeks worth of instruction in term 2 with some time for some consolidation at the end of the term. We know that the actual number of weeks in terms can change from state to state and from year to year, so we know that this is going to be a little bit flexible for you. This gives a suggestion from us at the OCA team about the order in which we suggest these units are taught, although we provide some more information about some of the dependencies in the precedence diagram. For each of the units that's featured on the yearly overview, we then provide some more detail in the unit overview. So the unit overview document features information for each of these units as shown on the screen here. So this is for the first unit in Year 9, Direct Proportion and Finance. You'll find the curriculum strands that it's designed to address in the curriculum or syllabus, and then a short description of the unit objectives. So what are the sorts of skills and knowledge that are being developed as a consequence of this unit. And then it gives a little bit of an indication in the last two columns about units that are prerequisite to this unit. So there are two there from year 8 that really, this unit depends on students being familiar with the content, knowledge and skills from 2 units in year 8. And there are another 2 units in the year 9 course that depend on this particular unit. So the unit overview is designed to just give you that at a glance idea about what's the content and skill in this particular unit. What do I need to consider that's come before as part of the mastery in mathematics in year 7 and 8, for example, and what are the succeeding units that depend on this particular unit. So you'll find a unit overview for each of the units that feature on our yearly overview. And that's true for the Australian curriculum version 9, the Victorian curriculum version 2, and the New South Wales syllabus. We then have a series of documents called the precedence diagrams. And the precedence diagrams are really important diagrams for your decision-making when you're moving units or rearranging the order of units. So the precedence diagrams show the learning intention dependencies over time across years 7 to 9, arranged by key concepts. They map out where concepts are needed to be taught first before teaching following concepts. Now, one of the things you know as mathematics teachers is that there's some optionality in terms of the order in which you teach concepts, but mathematics is also relentlessly hierarchical, right? So you need to know some things before you start to encounter other ideas. There are some dependencies that exist, and we can't just ignore those. So we've tried as part of this project with all of the teachers and the participating dioceses to create as much flexibility in terms of the units and lessons as possible, but we still need to acknowledge the fact that we're trying to build knowledge and skills over time, and this is where the precedence diagrams really help us. So the precedence diagrams show how the units can be arranged in different orders, and they try to show the dependencies that exist from one unit to another. So here's an example of a precedence diagram for the Australian curriculum. For those people who've worked with the Mastery in Mathematics Year 7 and 8 materials, you'll notice that we're making some adjustments to the precedence diagram to make it a little bit easier for you to move through and understand. So if we're looking at this diagram, starting with the direct proportion and finance unit, which is in green at the top of the diagram, it shows that it needs to be taught before you teach the unit 9AO2A exponents, right? So there's an arrow going from direct proportion and finance to exponents that indicates that you need to teach that direct proportion unit before teaching exponents. And you need to teach the exponent unit before you teach algebra, right? So what we're trying to do in the precedence diagram is to show you what units need to be taught in what order, and then some of the other units you can move around. So for example, the data analysis unit can be put almost anywhere in the sequence because there's no dependency on any of the year 9 content in other areas. And the same is true for probability. It can be maneuvered throughout the year, depending on where your school would like to put it. However, there are some other aspects that have to be right at the end. Quadratic equations and parabolas, it needs to come quite late in the year because there's a significant number of units that need to be studied before you get to quadratic equations and parabolas, and the same thing exists for trigonometry. There are a lot of component skills that sit within year 9 that need to be considered before we get to this unit. And so you'll find as part of the Mastery Mathematics Year 9 program, we have our precedents for Year 9. And we've also started to map out the precedents for all of the units from Year 7, Year 8, and Year 9. So every unit that we've created as part of this project and how they relate to one another can be found on one A3 sheet. And so you can print out a copy of this A3 sheet when we release it with the lessons at the end of this month so that you can check that the way that you're scheduling units is going to work, that there's no dependencies that you've forgotten or misplaced. So the precedence diagram is a really important diagram for you if you're planning to move units around or change the order of things. Some factors that you might need to also take into account when you're thinking about your yearly overview and making adjustments to the order, first of all, is your term length. So as I mentioned before, it's important that you are carefully considering the fact that you might only have an 8-week term if you've got a Commonwealth Games or an Olympics around. Sometimes we have 12 and 13 week term. So your term length is going to impact the amount of time that you have available, obviously, in each term, and it may impact some of your decisions about where some units will sit, because ideally we don't necessarily want to break a unit over the course of 2 terms, for example. It's also handy for you to think about the interruptions that occur to your school program, to the extent that you actually know what interruptions exist. So where do you have sporting carnivals, incursions or excursions, if you have camps occurring at particular times, or there's interruptions every Friday for a couple of weeks for some reason, that may reduce the number of lessons that you have available to you. These types of interruptions are things that you might consider when you're thinking about how you're going to schedule the units over the course of a year. And then it's worth doing a lesson count. So we provide resourcing for 108 lessons for the year. So how many lessons do you actually have in year 9 in 2025, for example? Count them up. And do you have more lessons than we provide resources for, or fewer? That will help give you some information that you need to make some adjustments to the units that you decide to use, and also the lessons from each unit that you decide to use. Once we've decided on our units, we know what the unit is roughly about. Using our unit overviews, we've checked the precedents. We can then move to our scope and sequence. So the scope and sequence diagram, it breaks our unit down into individual lessons. So that unit overview that we looked at before for direct proportion and finance, the first lesson or the first unit we recommend in year 9 has 11 lessons, and you can see in this screen snip of the scope and sequence that for each of the lessons we give an indication of the learning intention for that lesson and the syllabus or curriculum codes that are related to that particular lesson. So it's a place that you can go to get an idea about how the lessons are being scheduled for a particular unit. For those people who want even more information about each of the units and each of the lessons, you can delve into the unit plans. So the unit plans contain a number of pieces of information. First of all, at the start of the unit plan, we have a unit summary. So again, it gives an indication about what the objectives of the unit are, the curriculum codes that are being addressed in this particular unit, the parts of the achievement standards that this unit is helping to develop for students, as well as some of the general capabilities that you can find in the Australian curriculum and the Victorian curriculum, and similar ideas around working mathematically in the New South Wales syllabus. After that, we have some teacher guidance. So this is where we're taking some of the thinking that's gone into each of these lessons out of the heads of the expert teachers that have created them and tried to describe it for you. So in the teaching notes, you can find the equipment requirements for the unit so that there are no surprises when you get to a lesson that requires something different. It provides some context about where this unit fits compared to other units within the year level and also in previous years. And then you've got a series of teaching notes. So in the teaching notes, we're trying to describe some of the techniques that we're using to address certain concepts, some of the language that we've chosen to use, some of the language that teachers have chosen not to use, so they're avoiding in the lessons. We give a little bit of an idea about possible student misconceptions that are related to the topics covered in this particular unit, which we think is particularly useful for those teachers who are relatively new to some of these ideas or to teaching in general, and then some advice about adaptations to the units. So ways that you can make adjustments to it based on the students in your care. So that's the second part of your unit plan. And the last part of the unit plan is what we call the lesson detail. And essentially what the lesson detail is, it's a lesson by lesson account of what is planned in that particular lesson. So it's like a mini lesson plan, if you like. So it's got some information about the learning intention, the key vocabulary that you can find in that lesson, any activating prior learning that's covered at the early part of the lesson, the basic lesson content, as well as some practice tasks, some of them that we've created and some of them that are suggestions for you as teachers that you might use either in addition to what we've already planned or to replace some of the things that we've developed as part of this program. So some adjustments that you can make to the scope and sequence and to the lessons. You may choose to extend some of the lessons over multiple days. So you may look at the content for a lesson and say, gee, that's actually quite a lot for my kids, and knowing what I know about what my students know at this point in time, I might break this over 2 days. Or we're programming here, creating lessons that assume a 60-minute lesson. So you may have a shorter amount of time than that, 45s or 50s. So you may need to break the content up. You might combine some of the lessons for doubles or triples if you're running a timetable that runs doubles or triples. We know some schools reorder some lessons, just being mindful about some of the dependencies that exist between learning intentions in a unit. Sometimes you might skip lessons because you know that your students already have great proficiency in that area, or you may supplement the lessons with other materials that you've got as part of your school maths program. So these things that I've described so far comprise the curriculum resources, and you can find a lot of those available on our website, available for you to download and adjust however you like right now. We also provide lesson level resources, so materials that are generally student facing that will be available for you to take copies of for term 1 at the end of this month. So in terms of lesson resources, we provide 5 materials. We've got some lesson slides that are used or provided for you to use in your lesson. We have some booklets that are designed for students to attempt independent practice tasks. We have some reteach decks that are like short versions of the lesson. We have daily reviews. And then I've put sample assessments on the bottom of the lesson resources. The sample assessments are from our year 7 and 8 project, but essentially they are assessments that you can have a look at to get an idea about how you might create some assessments of your own for the year 9 project. So just to take a little bit of time to run through each of the components of the lesson slides. So we have, as part of our project, a slide deck. And essentially it's important to note that we see the lesson slides as a container for a lot of the information about the teaching and learning for this particular unit. So we could have chosen a variety of different ways to communicate that information. We could have bulked out the lesson details, so those mini lesson plans, we could bulk that out with far more information and more detail in there. We could have filmed some videos of teachers, which is quite a difficult thing to do, but upon consideration, what we decided to do was we'd provide some guidance in the slide decks. And so we know that some teachers and some schools will use the slide decks as they are or make adjustments to them. Some schools and some teachers will take the slide decks as helping to transmit some of that information out of the teacher's head who created the lessons to you as the teacher. And so it may replicate some of the activities and some of the instruction on your own whiteboard or through a OneNote or through a variety of other mechanisms, right? So the slide decks are there to hold some of the information about the lesson. So here on the screen, I have the starting point for a deck. So this is before we get to the teaching and learning of the new content. We have a variety of different sections in our deck. So you'll find at the start, we have a learning intention slide that just describes the major instructional cycles of the lesson and gives you a bit of an idea about the flow of the lesson itself. So what's the intended learning? How have we broken it up? So in the example that I'm showing here, the first instructional cycle is about generalizing numerical expressions. And then in the second cycle, we are starting to take those ideas of generalizing numerical expressions and we're going to use pronumerals. So we're just introducing some of these ideas around pronumerals. We then have some information that's teacher facing. So the difficulty gauges, we're trying to give you some information. If you pick up the slide deck and the materials, that we have these difficulty gauges that are associated with questions both in the slide deck and in the workbook that are supposed to provide some more information for you. We have a learning intention slide that some teachers choose to show their students and others use it just for their own information, just about what it is that we're trying to help the students know and be able to do as a result of this lesson, as well as some success criteria that you can use to guide your lesson towards mastery for students so that you know when we're on track. We have an equipment slide that some teachers choose to use just to make sure that students have out on the table the things that they need for this particular lesson. We also have some more information for teachers about some of the icons that are used throughout the teaching materials. So we have a key principles slide that has these engagement icons. So where we're running through some concept development, or we're in an I do phase of a lesson, when we're moving from I do to we do with a W, when we're checking for understanding. So that particular slide is there just to help you know what those letters are in the corner of the slides and what they indicate about what's happening in terms of the instructional cycle in that part of the lesson. We also have a slide that contains the engagement icons. So the engagement icons are some suggestions from our teachers about the ways that students might respond to particular ideas or prompts. So you'll find things like a whiteboard response, where students have many whiteboards where they might show you a response to a question, or they might be writing in their workbook, or there might be a pair share or a choral response, or there'll be sometimes where we're using concrete materials to develop an understanding of a particular concept. So these engagement icons go in the top right-hand corner. They are suggestions for you as a teacher to use if you think it's suitable for your class, or you can ignore and use in a different way if you like as well. We then have some key words. So we've isolated some words that we think are really important for students to know as part of the learning in each particular lesson, and we've created a keyword slide for each of them. Now, we've placed the keywords at the start of a lesson deck. And the reason that we've got them at the start is not because we intend for you as a teacher to run through each of these keywords and explicitly teach them before you get to the lesson. Rather, we've placed them all together at the start of the lesson so you know where to find them when you need them. Some teachers will rearrange and use these keywords before as part of their intellectual preparation. So they'll move the keywords around in their slide deck to the places where they think that they're going to use them. Some teachers don't necessarily use the keywords in the lesson, but will hide them, but they're there if they need them. So the keywords really are there as a support for you as a teacher to use as you wish across the course of the lesson. The next section in our slide deck is the Activate Prior Learning section. The purpose of this little mini cycle is just to review any important concepts or ideas that are really important for this particular lesson, that we're going to be building upon, that we're counting on students having some understanding of. Now, you may know your students really well and know that actually this learning they've got under control, that they've mastered this content. I don't actually need to reteach some of these ideas. Or you may look at some of the prior learning and think, actually, I've got to build this out a little bit because it's we've got to build this out a little bit because my students don't quite know as much as we'd hoped that we know at this point in time, and they just need a little bit more support. So this Activating Prior Learning section is there for you to use, and really it covers either concepts or skills that have been taught in previous lessons in Year 9 or in previous year levels. Then we get to the main lesson section. And the main lesson section usually consists of a number of what we call instructional cycles. So they are short cycles where a teacher is demonstrating or modeling a particular idea through a concept development or an I do phase. There's then a series of we do slides, which is usually where a teacher and a class are working together to solve problems, apply particular processes, to brainstorm about particular ideas. They're working together in this stage. And then we've got this you do slide, which is some practice opportunities for students before we release them to do some independent practice. And so the instructional cycle is designed to be sort of a short cycle, usually somewhere between 5 to 15 minutes, sometimes 20 minutes, depending on the size of the chunk. And we've bookended them with these blue slides because we know that some schools will move whole instructional cycles from one lesson to another. So by having these blue slides that indicate that, gee, this is the start of a new instructional cycle, that makes it a lot easier for you as a teacher or as a school to move instructional cycles as a whole lot from one lesson to another. After this instructional cycle, we usually have a series of independent practice questions that come in the form of our booklet, or the students can find in the booklet, that allow students to practice some of the skills that we've been working on in that instructional cycle. We call it independent practice, but that just means more independent of the teacher. So we know that some schools use those questions in small groups. Sometimes we set them for seat work or independent work. How you decide to use them is entirely up to you. We call them independent practice because it's independent of the teacher, except for when you're roaming around and asking those or answering those questions that students may have about the questions that we posed. At the end of the lesson, we have a quick lesson review. That's something you could show to students just to quickly give them an idea about the sorts of things that we've been thinking about and talking about and learning about in the lesson. We also include some teacher guidance. So this is in addition to the teacher guidance that sits in the unit plans. We've tried to provide a little bit of extra information. So some of the key teaching points that we really want to emphasize, some key questions that you might want to ask over the course of the lesson or as part of your review. We've just included that for you to use as you're preparing for the lesson. So these slide decks are there for you to use and to manipulate however you wish to. And they've been designed in such a way that they can be as adaptable as possible for your context. As well as the lesson slides, we provide a student booklet. So the student booklet, we have one booklet per unit. And we've tried to provide a range of different question types in the booklet. So they are designed to be options for you to choose from. You could choose to use all of the questions that are in the booklet. You can choose to use some of the questions. You can use some of these independent activities in the booklets at the end of a lesson, during a lesson, however you want to use them is up to you. We've assumed access to a textbook when we've put these booklet questions together. So what you'll find in the booklet is there are fewer routine type problems in the booklet, and we've tried to emphasize some more non-routine tasks in the booklet. The exception to this is when there's a representation that have been used in these particular lessons that are a little bit different to what you might find in a regular textbook. We provide a little bit more rehearsal. So we prioritize these non-routine problems in the booklet. They provide further practice for students. We also have our practical tasks sit inside those booklets. So at different stages in lessons, we have practical tasks as well as problem-solving tasks that sit within those booklets as well. Each of the booklets has a glossary, so it contains the word and a definition, and we've left space for examples and non-examples for you to use if you choose to use those as part of your teaching practice. And we've also got at the end of the booklet, a reflecting on the unit space and template. We know some schools will use the reflections sheet at the end of a unit. Some people choose to use it at the end of a week. They just make adjustments to that page and they use it as a wrap up of the learning for the week. Also, as part of the work that we're doing in the MIMS Year 9 is the provision of rich task lessons. So our rich task lessons are extended non-routine problem solving and investigation type lessons. They can be used at a variety of different stages in the lesson progression in a unit. So we have scheduled them in at particular points in a unit. So they might be there as lesson 5, but you can change the order of them. So we know some schools like to put some of the rich tasks at the start of a unit to really get things started for kids before heading into some of the other lessons. Other schools will put them right at the end of the unit. You can move them around however you wish, but just noting that often some of the ideas in those rich task lessons depend on some competency with some mathematical ideas and concepts that have been covered in some of the earlier lessons. And what we've tried to do with these rich task lessons is to make them multi-sectional so they can be broken up into smaller chunks. And we do that because we know that some schools like to have dedicated rich task lessons where they have a whole class or a whole lesson of extended problem solving or a rich task. Other places like to break them up and use them intermittently across the course of the week. It's up to you how you decide to use them. It's also worth noting that each of the individual lessons also contain problem solving and non-routine questions. So we've tried to include in every lesson some of these non-routine ideas that help students to work mathematically and to really exercise their mathematical proficiencies. We've also got some resources that we call the reteach decks. And our reteach decks essentially are like a mini lesson. So what we do is we take a lesson. In this particular case, this lesson is on pronumerals and variables. And what we've done is just boiled it down to the very essence of the lesson. And the idea behind these decks is there are times when you notice, either through the use of the daily review or through some other mechanisms, that in actual fact, the students in my class, they're not quite as proficient with this particular skill as I thought they might be. And we just need a 10 to 15 minute refresher here on this particular concept, because it's pretty important for what comes next. So to make that easier for you as a classroom teacher, we've provided these reteach decks. So they're very short decks. They provide a little bit of independent practice for you to use, and they are just there for when you need it. So you don't have to come up with a whole range of new questions. You don't have to go back to the original lesson. Instead, you've got this little mini reteach deck that's designed to take around about 10 or 15 minutes, where really it's a summary of that main lesson content. We know that some schools use them for the whole class. Like if you know that you need a bit more time on something in the activating prior learning part of the lesson, we know some schools use them in small groups, just as either revision of materials that's come before, or sometimes as pre-teaching for students who are quite advanced in their understanding of mathematics. Sometimes they can be set for individual work for students to rehearse and practice some of these skills that they might need some additional exposure to. Sometimes it can follow the main lesson as a bit of a top-up, and as I said, there are a lot of schools that use the reteach when they identify a need through the daily review. So you can find those reteach resources and download a copy of each of those through the OCA website. The last main component of our lesson level resources is the daily review. So the daily review is a short 5 to 10 minute review of learning from ideas that have come up and been mastered in the past. So here on the screen, you can see our daily review schedule. Basically, what we do is we schedule out for each of the key ideas in a particular year level. We schedule out an opportunity for students to review and retrieve knowledge and skills related to that particular idea. So over the course of a daily review, students will encounter a range of different concepts that they've studied in the past, and often they'll have multiple opportunities to rehearse and practice that particular skill or retrieve that particular knowledge over the course of a week, and then they'll have an opportunity to retrieve it 3 weeks later, then 6 weeks later, then 12 weeks later, 24 weeks later. So really what we've got is a well-sequenced review of content and ideas. So as I said, it's really fast-paced, 5 to 10 minutes. It shouldn't be taking you any longer than that. The slide decks that we provide are for whole class instruction. The idea here is that it's really an opportunity to cover ideas and concepts that have been mastered in the past. We've tried hard to sequence them over time, so to make sure that these ideas we've taught in the past and we're sequencing them and they keep cropping up at intervals that increase over time, so students have the opportunity to partially forget some of these ideas before coming back to them and being exposed to them again. And really it's about this fluency retrieval. So we're trying not to be in a situation where students go for 12 months without having to have recalled a particular piece of knowledge or practice a particular skill, but rather getting regular opportunities to return to ideas that have been taught in the past. So the daily review resources come in 3 forms. We've got an individual lesson deck. So that's just a pre-made deck that you can pull for a particular lesson that's aligned to our daily review schedule. We've got a master lesson deck, which just contains all the slides for a particular term that you can remix. And then we've also got a version, which is the topic deck, which contains all of the daily review slides for a particular topic. So our individual lesson decks, they are our 5 to 10 minute decks, and they are pre-made. You can add in extra components that you like depending on what you need, or more specifically, what your students need. To supplement some of these concepts in the individual lesson decks, you can use the topic decks. So the topic decks cover different curriculum strands. So for example, this one on screen is a number deck. The number deck's divided into specific areas like multiplication, addition, fractions. And the idea is that you would take some of the concepts from the topic decks to put into your daily review. So if you notice that your students just needed a little bit of more rehearsal on place value concepts because they weren't secure enough with those concepts, then you can take those daily review slides from our topic deck and put into your daily review, the individual daily review decks. The topic decks are organised by progression. So what we try to do is to include slides from each of our year levels and the learning intentions. So that means that you'll be able to go into a daily review deck, and even though you're teaching year 9, you'll be able to pick up content that was first introduced in year 8 and into year 7. So the idea is that you have access to precursor skills that you can practice over time. And really what we're trying to do is to simplify your location of specific slides for different year levels. The master decks, they are usually for a particular term. So they are different from our topic decks. So the master decks contain a range of different topics. So you can use those for formative assessment. You can copy slides from the master deck for further practice on certain learning intentions. They are just a recut version of our topic decks. They are specific for a particular year level. So they don't have year 7 and year 8 material in them. So the daily review use, some schools will use them as a standalone resource to complement your existing scope and sequence, or other materials that you're using, school-based or commercial materials. They are being created alongside our lessons. So it's important to note that as we go along in the early phases of this MIM Year 9 project, there are some topics that are not available until later terms. And just in the final few minutes that we have available to us today, assessment and differentiation. For differentiation, we provide a range of different supports. So we have some difficulty gauges on questions, some of the independent practice, both within the booklets, but also in the lesson. We provide a range of different levels of difficulty. We've got our open-ended tasks, some rich tasks, some problem-solving tasks that have some suggestions for ways that you can modify the prompt for students who are at different levels of proficiency and achievement. We know that some schools use the reteach decks to either support learners who require some more rehearsal or to extend other students into other ideas at different year levels. And the resources themselves are adaptable, so you can make adjustments to them based on your particular context. And just to hark back to, we've given some advice as to the way that you can adapt individual units in those unit plans. So some advice that's going to be really specific to specific units. In terms of assessment, we have some formative assessment embedded into the resources. So we'll have these checks for understanding slides that are meant to be points in the lesson, hinge points if you like, where you can make judgments about whether you need to reteach particular ideas, whether there are some members of your class who can head off to do some independent practice while you retain a smaller group to do some extra rehearsal or to break down the skills more. These sorts of resources can be integrated into your current or future assessment program. And as I said earlier in the webinar, we also have some sample assessments that we developed for year 7 and 8 that you can use as samples to be adjusted for your year 9 program. So please have a look at those sample assessments. I'm conscious of the time. It's 4:29 and you've listened to me speak at you for 45 minutes. If you'd like to pop some questions into the chat, I'm quite happy to answer some questions that you might have. We'll make a copy of this recording available after the event. So you can head to our YouTube channel to find both a copy of this webinar, but also some of the other professional learning videos that we make freely available, or you can head to the Ochre Education website for some additional information. For those that have to head because it's 4:30, thanks so much for attending today. I hope today has been useful, and please get in contact with us if there are extra questions that you have or you'd like to discuss further some of the resources that we're providing. So thank you.